I did grow up in Oneonta, as you mentioned. I grew up in a large family business, agricultural business. And then I did take some time. I left the area to go to college, and I purposefully came back with my children, my first son, actually. So we moved back to the area because I really do love it here. These communities are amazing. They're beautiful. I've traveled all over the world, and upstate New York and rural New York is one of the prettiest places you can live. The other thing for me is that we have all of the things that make us able to thrive, right? We have great people, we have water, we have land, we have smart farmers. I'm also a foodie. So being in New York, rural New York, my family fights about which corn is the best and can you eat it 3 hours later than it's been picked. Um, so, so grew up there. I live in Delhi now, as you mentioned. I'm a professor teaching at an access institution, which is an institution that really works to give people a step to the next level of their lives. And I've loved being a part of that. But as part of that, it felt like I've been throwing one starfish in the ocean at a time. So the story of the boy at the ocean with all the starfish washed up on shore. And the grandfather says, what are you going to do? This means nothing. There's all these starfish. And the little boy says, well, it means everything in the world to this starfish, throws it back in. I feel like I've been doing that for a while, and now I want to clean the beach a little bit. And so that's partially going to Albany to make bigger policy changes.
So I mentioned that you have a background in public service as the former Oneonta City Council member. What experiences from your time on the council have shaped or will going to shape your approach to state level politics?
Yeah, so I think when you serve on local committees and local boards, local government, you realize that we really want the same things, right? We want quality of life. We want our children to live happy, healthy lives. We want our schools to be good. We want our environment to continue to provide for us and us to provide safety to our families and our communities. So sometimes it's reminding ourselves that we're actually all on the same team. And I really felt like you could do that at Oneonta City Council. The people I worked with really did want what was best. And sometimes that didn't mean we wanted the same thing, but bringing that attitude to Albany, I think, is essential because when we have this notion that somebody across the aisle is out to get us, it isn't necessarily helpful for us to actually get to the things that we actually all want. We just have to figure out how to get there sometimes. So I think that was important from my knowledge there. The other thing is it taught me a lot about zoning. It taught me a lot about the IDA. It taught me a lot of the issues that are actually heading up to Albany and back into communities, right? So there's a dialogue and conversation between local government and state government. So that conversation and that dialogue is something that I've been a part of. And I think it's key to understanding how do local communities function in their government, and then how does the state then partner with that? So I think that's also really important that I learned from my experience on city council.
We have a lot of issues facing the 51st district in New York State here. What would you say are the most pressing issues facing your district?
Yeah, so for me, some of the top 3 issues, housing is number 1 for me. I sell real estate, as I've mentioned, and there isn't a conversation that doesn't come back to housing, right? If we want economic development, we have to have workforce housing. If we want, communities to stay here and flourish, we have to have housing for those people. We just need to work on our housing, and there's 2 things that I think are important here. One is we are gonna have to build, and we need to build sustainably and in a way that continues to keep our life beautiful here. The second thing is we need, as a state, to help our local communities. We don't need to stomp on home rule. We need to actually provide data to our local municipalities to help them with their zoning laws, help them put into place the structures that will not prevent them from growth, but also help them know what these zoning laws are going to do to their communities, right? What are the positives of this type of zoning and what are the negatives of this type of zoning? To do that kind of research, you need big money, and that has to come from the state level. Little towns, hamlets, villages, they can't afford those types of big data driven analyses. And so the state has to be helping with that. So I'd like to see the big data done and then a czar put into place that really works with our communities to help them increase our housing stock in a way that's effective for the communities. So that's one. Number two is the issue of 911,
Mhm.
increasing the 911 services to include domestic violence, substance abuse, and mental health specialists. When we look at our system, we want cops to keep us safe. We also need comprehensive services for our people in crisis in communities. Our communities are struggling with substance abuse. They're struggling to provide mental health. And we have placed that burden largely on our cops and our law enforcement. And we need to help our law enforcement and relieve them by providing additional services through 911. And I think that we can do that in an effective way in New York State without even actually having to increase our budgets. We have to just be creative in the way that we use the services that we actually already have. So we connect our opportunity organizations, we connect our substance abuse organizations into the 911 so that we can actually provide better services and keep us safer in our communities. And that is one of the issues for substance abuse as we think about it. Then my third issue, which I think is extremely important, and this is part of the stage of life I'm in and realizing what it takes to thrive in New York, and that is family care. We need to take care of our population in New York from day one to their older years. So for me, I have children, two of whom are neurodivergent, and in the process, meaning autism, ADHD stuff. Um, in the process of that, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, my son was failing. He we were getting 13 phone calls a week from the school district. He was really, really struggling. And then when we got services, it took us about 2 years to get those services. When we got those services, my son went from failing to a 93 average, a four-sport athlete, and playing in the marching band. And I want that for every rural child. And we can do that by supporting our school systems, by making the system itself easier to navigate for parents. I say all the time, we adopted our first son, and he's the one who has more significant challenges. I do not have neurodivergence, but many times it's biological. So we've made a system that's so entangled for people who it's difficult to navigate step by step by step processes. So we need to actually make those processes better. That's by supporting our education, that's supporting our communities, our disability services, childcare, right? We can't have working parents without kids being taken care of. So that's the beginning part. But the end part for me is that the other end of that for me is my mom is 80 years old and my mother is still building snowmen. And she loves it. In fact, every year she sends us her picture of her snowman in her backyard, and sometimes she grabs the neighbor kids, and but we know that that's not always going to happen, right? Like there's going to come a time when the snowmen aren't being built. And so I want to make sure that our seniors are able to age with dignity in their homes with home health care. Transportation in rural communities is extremely difficult. And it's even exacerbated further when you are a senior who can no longer drive and have medical appointments. I met with a potential constituent down in the deposit area, and he needs his medical care in Binghamton. It one day a week, they have a bus that takes people to Binghamton. Takes him 2.5 hours on the bus, and he can only make a doctor's appointment on Tuesdays as a result. And the reality is our medical system is not that flexible with getting those things. We live in medical deserts to begin with. So we need to aid our aging population with transportation systems, with medical care, and an increase in our facilities and services for our aging population. And the reason I'd say this is that for me, it's family care. I want to be also very clear is that the point of it is we actually all do better when we have intergenerational living, right? So my children, I asked them, who's got your back this year? And they said me, which was great. Um, But then it also said my mom, right? And so my children are thriving because my mom's thriving, and my mom's thriving because of my children. And I think that families, we need to support that. And that looks like lots of different kinds of families. Mine looks like a fairly sort of, average family, I guess. But there's all kinds of these family structures that we need to be supporting. So those are the things that I'm seeing as some of the top issues for our communities.
Like you mentioned, one of the issues that we are facing here is housing affordability as a major concern for many parts of New York, especially after the pandemic. How would you mentioned a little bit there, but how would you address the housing crisis in your district?
Yeah. So again, I think a lot of communities are trying to solve this. And one of the problems is that we can't step on home rule, right? Which is the notion that communities actually know a lot about what they need. So we need to aid them in making those decisions. So that's the housing czar. I also think we need to increase our incentives for people to build, right? And build sustainably. A lot of the projects where the money comes from the state are for huge projects, right? They're for units that are 100 units. Well, the reality is in rural New York, we don't need a 100-unit building. We might need a 12-unit building. We might need a building community that's a set of townhouses. Um, we don't need the same maximizing number. And with economies of scale, yes, it's cheaper to build a massive building. So we need to actually bring the focus to rural New York, which a lot of communities have not been able to do, or a lot of our representatives have not been able to do. So we need to bring that analysis and that attention to our communities and say, hey, we've got to subsidize how we help these houses get built. We've got to encourage people to build. And that doesn't necessarily fit a lot of the current structures of how we build. The state says, look, you build 65 units. Well, I live in Delhi. 65 units is not going to be what we put in. It's just not going to be feasible. But we need 12 units. We need 15 units. So we've got to be able to help our communities make that happen as well. So that's how I would like to see some of the state moving in that direction.
Now, let's move on to some bail reform topic here. Bail reform has been really a contentious topic in New York State, something often your opponent talks about. What is your stance on the current laws, and do you believe any changes are needed?
Yeah, so I'm aware that bail reform is extremely contentious. I think there's two things that I think are important. So, point one is we have to understand why this happened, why bail reform happened in the first place. Because I think when we get into these arguments, we lose sight of what was the catalyst for this. And that's we had a young 16-year-old kid in New York City who was accused of stealing a backpack and ended up in jail for 2 years, and it turned out he didn't steal the backpack, and he, due to the trauma from being incarcerated, killed himself, right? So that's the impetus for bail reform. It's not because we love criminals or because we want people to come out and commit more crimes. That is, we're soft on crime. This is the impetus. A study actually came out yesterday from the Brennan Center on Justice that there has been no increase in crime related to bail reform. So it is true that bail reform happened in 2020 at the same time that we saw an uptick in crime in the United States. But what we have to remember is that even though they happen at the same time, it doesn't mean that one caused the other. So I like to use the example, for instance, people buy a lot more bathing suits in April, um, and why and they also pay taxes in April. So it must mean that the more taxes you pay, the more bathing suits you buy. Well, is that true? No. It's true actually that people are paying their taxes because they're due in April, and people buy bathing suits in April because it's spring break, right? The two are not actually related. So the Brennan Center just came out with a study that is confirming other studies that crime is not upticking as a result of bail reform. That doesn't mean that people don't feel less safe. It also doesn't mean that our cops aren't feeling frustrated by the system. So I met with someone just the other day talking about bail reform. And I think really where we need to be working on bail reform issues is working with police officers, our law enforcement, to hear their concerns about frustrations and how we can tweak the system to make their work less frustrating. right? And that's as an overall picture. Cops have had they've had a tough couple of years. And so this is part of my solution with expansion of 911, right? We're asking cops to do too much and the frustration levels are high. And so I want to actually expand 911 to include these services in part to relieve some of that frustration of our law enforcement. Um, so I think that there's evidence, and I'm an evidence-based person. I think there's evidence that bail reform is not causing crime. Um, and there is some need to ensure that our 16-year-old kids aren't put in jail for extended periods of time simply because they're poor. And so I think this is part of, for me, the balance of thinking about how we proceed with bail reform.
Yeah, given your background in criminal justice, you're a professor in it. You have a doctorate in it. What is you sort of you went into it a little bit there, but what is your stance on how to improve public safety and justice in your district?
Yeah. So there's lots of this is usually if we prevent crime, we become more safe, right? We become safer when we invest early on. So even the report that came from the Brennan Center, but these are known in the criminal justice world, right? Get having services for communities, right? Having jobs for communities, having economic development, having employment and programming for teenagers. So when I'm teaching my classes, one of the things we know is that the most likely perpetrator are teenagers. And crime goes up in the summer because what's happened to teenagers in the summer? They don't have places to go or things to do. They don't have constructive things to take up their time. And so that is something that we can do to prevent crime in the first place, right? So this is employment opportunities for young individuals, sports programs, community events, providing safe spaces for our kids, our community members, um, and as well as things like, and sounds rudimentary, but lighting, right? Having street lights, having lighting in community makes people feel safer because it is safer. So we need to invest in our early programming so that we can actually make sure that our individuals don't make it to the criminal justice system in the first place. I also, one of my big issues, I teach a class on trauma and crisis intervention. I was a crisis intervention worker in Chicago for 6 years while I was doing my undergraduate. And um, we know that when we treat childhood trauma, we decrease our healthcare costs. We decrease their use of substance abuse. And I want to make sure that we're funding our school systems so that we can provide crisis and trauma intervention at an early age and catch them before they hit the criminal justice system. So those are some of the things that I would like to see implemented in every school in rural communities and actually across the state is trauma intervention and trauma informed care in our schools. And we've got to fund that in order to make that happen. But it actually is cheaper on the back end, right? So like if we fund these programs early on, we save money later. So childhood trauma, the data suggests that there's $74 billion a year in care costs due to childhood trauma. So if we can cut that at the beginning, we actually be fiscally responsible in doing that.
Let's move a little over to change topics here for economic growth here. What are your steps to promote economic growth and job creation in rural districts? It's such a different, you have agricultural tourism, you have ecotourism, all coming here into Southern Catskills. It's a very touristy area,
Mhm.
especially during summer, obviously. So, what are your ideas on sort of promote more economic growth and more job creation in our area?
So I think there's a couple places to start here, right? I actually grew up in a business family. These are the conversations we had at the dinner table, right? And I still have a brother who runs a large company here, having conversations with them. And one of the things that it all comes back for me a lot of times to housing. They're having trouble getting workers in our communities because we don't have workforce housing, right? There's companies that actually are expanding and they can't get the workers that they need because their workers can't find housing. I have met with one of the larger companies in this district, and they said we always bet on New Yorkers. They had actually considered putting their facility in another location, but they found that New Yorkers, rural New Yorkers, know how to work. We know how to get things done, and we're committed to our communities. And they said we don't want to go somewhere else, right? But we're also struggling to house our employees, right? So I actually think one of our economic development processes has to be housing. We also have to have the infrastructure of internet. Um, we have places here where Catskill's a little different, but I can barely make it to around the district and make a phone call. I'm driving. I've put almost 8,000 miles on my car in the last couple of months. I'm everywhere, and I can't make phone calls while I'm there. And that is an economic development issue, and it's also a safety issue, right? If we are unable to make calls to our emergency services due to those lack of internet. So I think that's number two, right? Is getting the infrastructure for that. Then I think we support our businesses, right? We support our businesses by helping them navigate systems and grants when there are grant opportunities for our businesses. We work to figure out what needs they have and then how do we support those needs. And when I'm out on the campaign trail, what I'm hearing from businesses is they need housing. So sometimes economic development um, links into other areas. And this is an area that I think is really important to link into. So, yeah.
Now, as a mother of a neurodivergent children, we talked about a little bit about how would you advocate for improved resources. Can you just draw on back a little bit more on that, and how would you advocate for improved services, resources, excuse me, and support for families with special needs?
Yes. So, first, I would like to say that I think it's incredibly important that we have people who are willing to speak about these things and be at the table. Because I know parenting two children with neurodivergent conditions, with neurodivergence, it is extremely difficult. It is time consuming and stressful and all of those things. We need to make these systems more streamlined. So for this is an area that I actually diverge quite heavily with on Hochul. She wants to privatize the process of essentially processing the paperwork. And I think that is a terrible idea. When we start privatizing these kinds of systems, people are trying to make money off the system as opposed to provide the services. And so for me, it's extremely important that we continue to have local providers helping our communities because the reality is sending something to Albany and it getting lost in the paperwork is not helpful to a family who's struggling with the needs of their child. Um, so we want to streamline the process. And this also means we need to provide more healthcare providers. It often takes a family 6 months to a year to even get the testing that's necessary for their kids. There are timelines, and then so that's sort of outside of the school system because I think there's a need to look at that structure of how we receive services. Um, the structure of the system is extremely layered. It's extremely difficult to navigate, and we cannot continue to place barriers in front of these families. These families already have barriers to getting things done for their kids. So that's one piece. The second piece is the public education, right? So public schools must provide services to children, and parent after parent after parent that I talk to of children generally, but also particularly those who have children with needs, is that it's very difficult for the school district to provide for their students, and it takes a long time to get the services they need. I firmly believe that that is not because schools don't want to provide them. I think it's because they financially have a burden that's difficult for them to provide them. And so they make sure that you really, really need the services because the money is going to impact them. We at the state level cannot allow money to continue to impact these small school districts from not providing for their community, right? For not providing for their students. And again, I do not blame teachers. I think teachers are doing the best they can. And I think these school districts are doing the best they can. There are realities. They simply don't have the income in many cases, and there's already starving the education system. I want to be a part. They're going to be renewing, well, not renewing. I'm sorry, excuse me, relooking at the formula for education expenditures from the state. And I want to be a part of that conversation because I think rural New York, it takes more to educate in some respects, right? We've got busing that isn't included. In some of more urban areas, they have less need for busing. So we have got to start taking these things into account and students with special needs as and we're understanding special needs better now. So we actually it's not that we have necessarily more children who are neurodivergent. We just are understanding it better, and as that becomes the case, we need to continue to fund our schools so that they feel like they can provide these services for these kids, and really empower our school districts to help the kids, which is ultimately what they want to do. So that's what I
Yeah.
would do. So for me, it's a two-pronged approach. First, we need to make the system itself for disability services, and then we also need to look at the school systems.
So finally, Michelle, when folks go to the voting booth on November 5th, why should folks vote for you over your opponent?
Yeah, so I think there's two main reasons, to be honest. Oberacker, uh, he sits on the opioid substance abuse committee, and he misses meetings in a district where we have one of the highest populations of fatalities due to substance abuse. He is simply not doing his job. And I'm a person who knows how to go to work and do it hard, right? So I have two jobs. Have three children. I know how to get things done. And simply isn't doing them. The other thing is when we look at these conversations, rural New Yorkers have been left out of the conversation. Rural New Yorkers have not had a seat at the table. And I just saw a quote the other day is that if you are not at the table, you're on the menu. And and the reality is we've been on the menu. And we can't have somebody who's in Albany saying, I can't get my job done because I've got bad colleagues and failing to show up at meetings. I am not going to say that I can't get my job done. I am not going to miss meetings. I am not going to let rural New York be on the menu.
We were talking to Michelle Frazier, candidate for the 51st Senate District for the New York State Senate. Thank you so much for joining me on the program, letting me know your thoughts on the issues for this new upcoming election. Again, thank you so much for doing this. Do really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.